Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Brian O'Donnell, and I am Director of Campaign for Nature. Just briefly note that this press conference will be recorded, and the recording will be available on YouTube shortly after the conclusion of the event. Before we get into our detailed comments about the draft text, on behalf of the Campaign for Nature, I would just like to take a moment to express our thanks to all of the parties to the convention, to the Secretariat, and to the co-chairs who have put in so many hours developing this framework. We also would like to thank the COP presidency and COP host. We all know that nature does not have any boundaries, and we must all work together in a state of cooperation and a spirit of compromise. And it has been exciting to see that leadership from parties to get to that point. We hope that continues, and that also spreads to other areas of global cooperation to help solve the world's challenges. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers who all have deep experience in the issues that are central to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. To my left is Jennifer Corpuz, who represents the IIFB, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and is also Director of Policy at NIATERO. To her left is Dr. Enrique Salah, Explorer in Residence at the National Geographic Society and founder of Pristine Seas. To my right is Dr. Kina Murphy, who is Chief Scientist for Campaign for Nature. And to her right is Mark Opel, Finance Lead for the Campaign for Nature. To start, I'll provide a few brief remarks on my thoughts of the draft text as it stands. This draft framework has some very strong aspects and some aspects that are not up to par. We're happy to see the inclusion of a target to protect and conserve at least 30% of the world's lands and oceans. If approved, it will mark the largest global commitment to land and ocean conservation in history. The 30 by 30 target includes important elements regarding indigenous rights and important components regarding connectivity, effectiveness, and a focus on the areas most important for biodiversity. There is, however, a key clarification that is needed in the target, specifically regarding the ocean, and my colleagues will address that specific point. We also agree with many of our colleagues in the environmental community who have expressed concern regarding Goal A. Specifically, the framework should include a 2030 outcome target to halt extinctions, reduce extinction risk, and restore the abundance of species. And that's a key missing component, we feel, in the framework. Finally, we want to recognize how important the contribution of Indigenous peoples and local communities have been to the development of this framework. They have changed the dialogue here within the Convention on Biological Diversity, and we are grateful for their tireless advocacy in the development of this framework. With that, I will turn it over to Jennifer Corpuz.
Thank you very much, Brian. From the beginning, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity has said that there's no way that we can meet the ambition of the post-2020 framework and Target 3 without taking into consideration the territories of Indigenous peoples and local communities. We urge the parties to embed a strong rights-based approach and include the rights of IPLCs in all key targets. We have analyzed the text. We have, over the last 4 years, come together as Indigenous peoples representing the 7 socio-cultural regions of the world. We represent 10,000 different nations, peoples, and we work to come here with one voice. We work to communicate that clearly to the parties, to the co-chairs, and to everyone participating in this process. And we are pleased to see that in Target 3, we have followed the science and we have addressed the experience that Indigenous peoples have in relation to forest conservation. It's important for the rights of Indigenous peoples to be there, and while it's not the exact wording that we had proposed in the beginning, we feel that it is a good compromise and that it addresses the concerns that we have, and it provides us with enough basis to continue working in full partnership with the parties, with the countries. We think that it's a good basis for us to be able to influence policy at the national level. So we urge the ministers who are now closeted in the room upstairs not to reopen the text on Indigenous people's rights within Target 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. We'll now hear from Enrique Salah.
So the draft Target 3 says protection of at least 30% of land, fresh water, and ocean. But it is important to ensure that it's 30% of each. We need at least 30% of the ocean protected by 2030, because without a healthy ocean, there is no chance for a healthy planet. The ocean is 70% of our life support system. But the ocean has lagged behind in conservation because we have been told the myth that we cannot protect more because we have to fish more to feed the growing human population. The truth is that we reached peak fish 25 years ago. And today, most of the fish stocks are overfished. So more fishing effort will not give us more food, but will only continue the depletion of seafood worldwide that so many depend on. But I have seen with my own research that when we protect well the right areas, marine life comes back spectacularly. Marine life grows older and larger and reproduces much more and for longer periods of time. And the spillover of fish and eggs and larvae helps to replenish the fisheries around these areas. So fishermen now are catching more around these marine reserves than before when they were fishing all over the place. And studies, including our own research, shows that if we protect the right 30% of the ocean, we will have more fish to catch, rather than the status quo, which is just a serial depletion, the law of diminishing returns. But the ocean is not just what we can extract from it. The ocean is a magical place. It's full of wondrous creatures. We just came back from the beautiful island of Dominica in the Caribbean, where we were swimming with sperm whales, these giants of the ocean, 10, 12, 15 meters long, gentle giants. We were swimming with them in the surface while they were resting in between dives. They go down for 45 minutes on one single breath to 1,000 meters deep to catch giant squid. They come back to the surface, and then they rest, and they defecate, and they fertilize with that the surface waters, which helps the plankton to grow, to bloom, and that also helps to absorb carbon dioxide and help us mitigate climate change. So we know that the more abundant marine life is, the more carbon marine life can sequester to help us mitigate climate change. So every dollar that we invest in well-protected marine areas generates $10 in economic output and helps to create jobs. So even if we are just selfish, if we just focus on growth, food, and human survival, we absolutely need 30%, at least 30% of the ocean protected by 2030, and we hope that that will be very clear in the final agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique. We'll now hear from Dr. Kina Murphy.
Thanks, Brian. That was inspiring just listening to Enrique. But I think Minister Guilbeault really put it perfectly. The 30 by 30 target for biodiversity truly is the equivalent of 1.5 degrees for climate change. Humans have already converted more than 50% of the planet's surface to human use. New spatially explicit land use scenarios show that 1.2 million square kilometers of land requiring conservation attention is projected to be lost to intensive human land use change by 2030, and therefore requires immediate protection. If this framework is adopted in its current form, it would be a historic moment for biodiversity. But we have to remember that 30 by 30 is the absolute minimum we need to do to protect and restore our biodiversity. In a study by Jung et al., scientists ranked optimal areas for maximizing improvements to carbon retention, water provisioning, and species conservation. And they found that the top-ranked 30% of the areas would conserve 62.4% of the estimated carbon stocks in the world. They also found that 60.8% of all clean water provisioning and improving the conservation status of, and that it would also improve the conservation status of 69.7% of all species considered. So this is rightly considered the minimum, given that we have already lost 60% of our terrestrial species in the past 50 years. We should understand this is a starting point and recognize that we must continue to do more beyond 2030. First, though, we need to make sure that the parties come together to finalize and approve this agreement. As they do so, we encourage them to add language clarifying that this target sets at least 30% as a target for land areas and at least 30% for ocean. The science is clear. That is 30% figure must relate to both in order to ensure the right level of ambition and to effectively respond to the biodiversity crisis. This could be a historic moment. Let's hope that the parties work together to make sure that it is.
Thank you, Kina. And now Mark Opel will address some of the finance aspects of the framework.
Thanks, Brian. We've been focused on the 4 numbers we consider to be the key in the GBF and are happy to see the brackets have been removed on all of them in the latest text. First, we're pleased to see the goal of closing the biodiversity gap by $700 billion annually, but the language should make it clear that that gap needs to be closed by 2030 and not by 2050. Second, we're happy to see a target of reducing subsidies harmful to nature of at least $500 billion a year in Target 18. Third, we see a material increase in the target for total financial resources of $200 billion. And finally, we welcome the increased ambition reflected in the international resource mobilization targets. The commitment to increase international funding from developed to developing countries to $20 billion annually by 2025 and $30 billion annually by 2030 represents a doubling and then a tripling of current levels of approximately $10 billion per year. This is a good start to generating the resources developing countries will need to implement the GBF, including 30 by 30. We would always like to see more and believe that $60 billion a year is a more appropriate amount based on the science and the economics. But it will be up to developing countries and developed countries to agree on what is an acceptable political compromise on this very challenging target. We applaud the leadership of countries and philanthropists that have made pledges of increased international funding for biodiversity in the run-up and during this COP, and they have set us on a path to meet the initial goal of doubling current levels of public international funding. Canada has made 3 different pledges that multiply their historical levels of international biodiversity funding. We've seen commitments to double international biodiversity funding from large funders like the EU, France, and Germany, and we've seen increased commitments from others. And yes, we are going to need to see this ambition from these leaders ratcheted up with even bigger numbers over the term of the Global Biodiversity Framework. You can find all the pledges that have been made to date of biodiversity, international biodiversity funding at our real-time tracker at naturefinance.info. While we're pleased with the targets and the pledges made toward meeting them so far, we need more countries to make commitments to have real confidence that the international funding targets will be achieved over the next 8 years. Less than 1/3 of the members of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, or DAC, have made pledges, less than 1/3. There can be no free riders here. We need to hear from DAC countries like Austria, Belgium, Finland, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Korea, New Zealand, Sweden, Switzerland, and many others. And it's time for other countries with the capacity to contribute to also step up. Countries like Qatar, which just got done spending $220 billion on the World Cup. Saudi Arabia, Singapore, the UAE, and others are in a position to contribute. And we think China, as the 2nd largest economy in the world, has the capacity to increase its financial commitments. We know all these countries want an ambitious GBF. They've said it. It's now time for everyone to put their money where their mouth is and commit, and more importantly, to fund the amounts needed to meet the targets in the GBF. Donor countries met the commitments they made for international finance in the last decade, and we look forward to them meeting their commitments made here in Montreal. Nature depends on it, and the world will be watching.
Thank you, Mark. With that, we have a few minutes for questions, and also would note that we will also be available outside of the briefing room if we run out of time. So why don't we start? Looks like gentleman in the far back left.
My question is about how to ensure accountability of the agreement, given that the GBF is not legally binding. Benji Jones with Box.
Thank you, Benji. I can start and others can join in. You're correct that the framework on its own won't guarantee accountability. This will require civil society. This will require all of us in Indigenous communities, in NGO organizations, in other entities to make sure that the countries live up to this pledge. We have to take them at their word here today if they make an agreement, but we also have to do, as others have said, trust but verify. That means that each year, looking in, have they made these financial contributions? Have they met their area-based targets? Have they respected the rights of Indigenous people and practiced free, prior, and informed consent? So that is a responsibility of all of society, and it can't just be what's within the framework. It has to be an all of government and all of society approach.
There is a willingness to evolve new systems of accountability, actually, in this section on monitoring, review, and reporting. And we have started it. The SBI has started it in terms of a peer review process among parties. So that's something that's new, and it indicates a willingness of the convention to move further in terms of accountability. We also note that there is language on rights, and in particular human rights and the right to a safe, clean, sustainable environment. And for us, that would reference the human rights process, and that would bring that into play in terms of demanding accountability. It's the same for Indigenous people's rights. It links the rights to the human rights systems. And lastly, Target 20 contains language on environmental rights defenders. And we feel that that is something, if the indicators are developed right, then that would contribute immensely to accountability in the framework. Thanks.
Yes, here in the third row.
Thank you, Regina from China Dialogue. This question is addressed to Mr. Enrique Salah. Some say that the current text has already, on the 30 by 30, has already implied the protection of 30% of the ocean. But what are the risks of countries not specifying on protecting 30% of the ocean on the text? What are the specific risks you think there will be?
Yeah, well, first of all, 30% is just a milestone. It's not a goal, right? We know that we need about half of the planet in its natural state if we want to prevent the collapse of our life support system, and also if we want nature to help us prevent a climate catastrophe. So we do not have the luxury of protecting less than 30% of the ocean, because most of stocks of fish are overfished, pollution everywhere. Ocean is warming, becoming more acidic. So it is absolutely essential. We cannot have that. The global biodiversity framework, it will not succeed if we don't protect at least 30% of the land, at least 30% of the ocean.
Yes, here.
Thank you. Hi, my question is for Jennifer here. And this is Stella Fall from Interpress Service and Earth Journalism Network. Jennifer, you just said this is a good compromise, yeah, especially for IPLC. So we don't, if you think about DSI and ABS, so keeping those two issues in mind, would you still call it a good compromise, or is there a disconnect between the two?
Thank you for the question. We have been monitoring closely the DSI negotiations as well. And currently in Goal C, as well as in Target 13, which are the main ABS targets of the framework, it includes specific language on digital sequence information. And if we reference it back to the text that has been developed specifically on DSI, it establishes a process with guidance that says that the rights of Indigenous peoples to traditional knowledge associated with the resources will be respected. Indigenous peoples will be part of the governance of a multilateral system that will be developed. And indigenous peoples will also be the main beneficiaries, recognizing that it's indigenous peoples that contribute the most to biodiversity conservation and sustainable use.
Thanks. This is also a question for Jennifer. In the 30 by 30 target, there is language about sustainable use. Could you say something about that? Because I could see it being a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it provides for indigenous peoples to, use the forest for their livelihood, but on the other hand, it, also allows for larger industrial things there.
What we need to note is that the language has changed. In fact, there was a compromise language offered by one of the parties, and it has been reflected in the current text. So it's not sustainable use, unregulated or not, not within bounds. It's sustainable use that are consistent with the conservation objectives. So that kind of language gives us comfort because, in reality, some of the protected area categories allow for sustainable use. From the indigenous side, when we say respecting and recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples, it is customary sustainable use, and it also in a way references the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and self-determination for us to be able to decide how we use. And if we, I'll stop there. It's bounded is the main answer to the question.
Yes, go ahead.
You referenced historic. I mean, you and also Kina referenced the historic nature of this. I mean, for people who don't follow this regularly, what maybe kind of provide some context of the historic and are there concerns still? I mean, if this text stands, is there anything still missing or concerns you have that haven't been addressed that you're hoping tonight will be addressed?
So on the 30 by 30 target, that is really, I think, that's one of the most historic components of this framework. There has never been a conservation goal globally at that scale. This puts us within a chance of safeguarding biodiversity from collapse. Most of the targets in the past have had incremental changes approaches. The Aichi targets had a very insufficient 17% of the world's lands and 10% of the world's oceans, which scientists said was wholly inadequate. We're now within the range that scientists think can make a marked difference in biodiversity. And we have never seen such a scale of conservation commitment on a global scale ever before in history. So we're starting to talk about solutions that are commensurate with the size of the problem, at least when it comes to the conservation component of this. Separately, and Jennifer could speak to this, we've never seen such a historic commitment to indigenous leadership and rights in a conservation agreement. So those two aspects alone are history-making components of this framework. Absolutely, there are, to the second part of your question, there are absolutely missing components to this. You heard some of this on the species targets. We feel like they are completely underwhelming and need to be done. The finance issues, while it is certainly a major increase over past, it doesn't reach the level that we thought is needed, and finance is critical for implementation. So this is not a perfect agreement as it stands by any stretch, but that nonetheless, it is still an historic agreement if it is adopted. And I don't know, Jing may want to add to that as well.
Yes, just confirming that this is the first CBD text and so, global strategy that we have seen that adequately, more or less adequately addresses the concerns of indigenous peoples. But we couldn't have done any less because this is what the science has shown. And if we really need to be evidence-based, indigenous people should rightly be reflected in the text. So that's just confirming what Brian said, that that is historic and long overdue.
Sounds like we have time for one more question before we need to move off the stage, but we will be able to talk to people afterwards. Yes, this gentleman over here.
Thanks, Juan Majorca from Mexico. Question for Jennifer. You mentioned that you somehow were representing over 10,000 indigenous nations in these negotiations. And it's kind of hard to believe that there is like no divides, like considering this wide range of different nations. So if there were, so which would be the, like, let's say, like divisive points that are difficult to agree, like considering this big community? Thanks.
The context of indigenous peoples all over the world and in the 7 social-cultural regions varies very widely. And the rights recognition, for example, is very patchy around the world. In Asia and Africa, indigenous peoples are not even recognized as indigenous peoples. We either have answers that everyone is indigenous or no one is indigenous. So what we have tried to do is develop our language proposals in such a way that it addresses the different contexts. And we feel like, although the language now here is very general, it does cover the many different contexts. Some of the indigenous people, especially with strong rights recognition in country, wish that the language were stronger and more specific. However, we have to take into consideration that we are found in very different contexts.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And just a reminder that all of these remarks are on the record and they will be available on YouTube shortly. Thank you very much.